Okay, hello, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. It is 10 a.m. right now at School of the Arts, University of Science Malaysia, and I'm Dr. Sarena Abdullah, and I am moderating the session for today. Today we have, I have with me here online on the downwards part of the world. Okay, Dr. Wulan Dirgantoro, who is currently the McKenzie Postdoctoral Fellow from School of Culture and Communication at the University of Melbourne. I decided to invite Dr. Wulan Dirgantoro to share with us today her research on Hilda Soemantri, especially in regards to the issue of gender and also experimental art scene in Indonesia, because I realized that we have quite a number of students actually doing research, of course, in terms of, staff, scope the art staff and all that, me and a few are doing like quote unquote art history here in School of the Arts, but we have postgraduate students, for example, doing research in regards to art history as well, though it is, I think, like mostly, Malaysia or China topic, okay? But, and also, we have also one or two students doing research on topics from Indonesia as well. So that's actually the premise of having Dr. Wulan Dirgantoro, so that she can share with us more of her own research, and also later on we could have some sort of discussion with Dr. Wulan and questions from the audience as well in regards to her own research, her research practices, and all that, and especially for postgraduate students, if you have any questions in regards of art history methodology or the kind of, concerns or question, you can always post to Dr. Wulan these questions as well. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Wulan Dirgantoro from the University of Melbourne to present to us her topic entitled Investigating Hilda Soemantri, Gender and the Experimental Art Scene in Indonesia. Okay. The floor is yours, Dr. Wulan.
Thank you, Dr. Sarena, for the introduction and also for the invitation to speak today. I'm very excited to share my work on Hilda Soemantri, but it's also a work in progress. So I would appreciate any thoughts, feedback from everyone on this. So I have presented this paper quite early on ICAS. So Sarena, you may have heard bits and pieces of this already. So I'll start sharing my screen. Hope you can see that. Okay, all right.
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. So my presentation today will discuss the works of Hilda Soemantri, artist and academic from Indonesia. The presentation will be divided in two parts. The first part, I will talk about her solo exhibition in 1978 at the Taman Ismail Marzuki Gallery in Jakarta. And so the first part of the lecture will talk about, or the presentation, sorry, we'll talk about Hilda's relationship to the experimental art scene, as well as her position as a newly arrived Indonesian academic from the US. I will also talk about the reception of her exhibition at that time. And in doing so, the presentation will address several issues, namely what role does gender play in the reception of experimental art in Indonesia, in what ways did the experimental engage with the medium? And the second part of the lecture, I've actually included some discussion about Hilda's position as an art historian. And so this is connected to the final point of the presentation, which is about the relationship between experimental art scene and academia in Indonesia. So that's why the title of the lecture or the presentation has been altered a little bit. So it's not just focusing on the experimental art scene, but it's also about the writing of art history in Indonesia. So what started my interest in looking at Hilda's work, because she's well known as a ceramicist. When I was still doing my undergraduate degree in Indonesia, I remember on the second year of my study, a group of us wanted to meet Hilda to gain more experience, knowing about her studio, about her practice. But Hilda was not available to receive us during that day. She was already in the final stage of her illness, and she passed away in 2003. So that was a big loss for Indonesian ceramics scene, if you like, but similarly also to Indonesian art history community. And so going back to Hilda, that's this is the a building of the Jakarta Art Institute, and all those mural there are a mural of the institute's distinguished professors and founding members. So Hilda, as you can see, is right on the center. So it's a bit of background. Hildawati Soemantri Sidarta, also known as Hildawati Sidarta or Hilda Soemantri, was born in Jakarta in 1945 from an upper middle class family. When she was 8 years old, her family moved to the Netherlands for her father's study, and the family returned to Indonesia when she was 13 years old. It was during her high school in Jakarta that her teacher introduced her to pre-modern art. Hilda then entered the Faculty of Fine Art and Design at the Bandung Institute of Technology in '64 and chose ceramics as her major. Hilda then received a Fulbright Hays grant to study in the US in 1973 to the Rhode Island School of Design before continuing an MFA degree at Pratt Institute in 1976. Upon returning, she founded the ceramics major at the Jakarta Art Education Institute, later become Jakarta Art Institute in '79, where Hilda stayed and built the, pretty much contributed to the development of the institute until her passing from cancer in 2003. After finishing her MFA, Hilda later went on to study PhD at Cornell University. She first enrolled in an MA program and finally completing her PhD in 1995 on the Department of Art History and Archaeology. So her study at Cornell University under the supervisions of Stanley O'Connor and O.W. Walters, both experts on Southeast Asian art and history, alerted her to the interdisciplinary nature of artworks from Southeast Asia. Furthermore, O'Connor encouraged his students to learn one of the languages in Southeast Asia in order to gain a deeper understanding of the life of the makers as well as the life of the artworks. In Hilda's case, this wasn't a problem because she's already an Indonesian native speaker. So when Hilda returned to Indonesia, in the 1970s, or the early New Order Indonesia has been considered as an extremely fertile period of experimentation in the arts, While political regime solidified its authoritarian control over the general population that stifled the development of arts in the 80s, the 70s actually, there was still a genuine sense of energy in experimentation and innovation, shaped also by a robust debate on Indonesian art and culture. So during that time, the Gerakan Seni Rupa Baru Indonesia, or the New Indonesian Art Movement, a group that comprised of art students in the early 20s, organized a series of exhibitions between 75 and 79 that spurred a furious debate on experimentation and art making in the national media. Now, I would like to highlight here the group's core aesthetic, which is the use of the ready-made objects. Now, turning away from the conservatism of art academies during the time that focuses on high art, namely painting and sculpture, the group of art students stated that objects in art should no longer represent, but rather appear as they are. So art as medium should not seek to represent an emotional state, but to invoke the emotional response of the viewer through everyday objects as part of the art making. Now, as you can see here on the slides, works by Jim Supangkat, and the detail in the middle, and also another image by an artist that gets still to be identified. The objects that the group selected in this is the first, the second exhibition, can be categorized as abject and or quotidian ones. True to the points in their manifesto, they also published a manifesto in 79. Some artists deliberately created abject or object works that aim to provoke negative feelings. For example, Supankat's installation here of baby covered in thick substance and pierced by a large syringe has certainly evoked a strong reaction from both critics and supporters of the group. Now, so when Hilda returned from her study in 77, this is after her PhD, the scene appeared to be set for her experimental works. The Dewan Kesenian Jakarta, or Jakarta Art Council, through its institutional arm, Taman Ismail Marzuki Cultural Center, provided support and encouragement for many artists, writers, actors, filmmakers to engage with experimental and new forms of artistic practices. In his introduction to for Soemantri's solo exhibition in 1978, Ajib Rosidi, writer and director of the Jakarta Art Council, quoted the artist, "This was not an exhibition of ceramics, but clay as a medium of fine art, karya tanah liat." So Soemantri invented the exhibition here to show a new and expanded capacity of clay beyond its quotidian function. So this is the exhibition catalog of Soemantri's solo in 1978. So the catalog listed 15 works, with the earliest work dated in 71 and the more recent works in 78. So I guess closely before the exhibition. The objects in the exhibition, despite using clay as primary medium, were no longer as mere vessels or containers. The audience could see hollow cylindrical shapes with some broken pieces rearranged the main body. Here in the example here, glazed cylinders arranged neatly in the grid, an arrangement of spherical objects with splits and openings or sunk into the ground. During the time when knowledge of ceramics was mostly confined to functional objects and museum relics, the exhibition presented a new perspective of this medium. Here's another example of her work, the one that we use as a poster for this exhibition. So one work in particular exemplified the artist's experimentation in combining forms and space. In this work here, Untitled 4, Soemantri placed 3 white large rectangular objects, 2 broken and 1 intact. Around the three rectangular objects, the position and arrangement of small broken pieces of dried clay. On first sight, the small pieces of clay seem to be placed randomly, but on a closer look, Soemantri placed the pieces only on one side of each rectangular place in a neat and flowing curvilinear lines. The viewer needed to walk around the work in order to arrive at this side. Now, according to one critic, the installation was Soemantri's attempt to recapture an incident in her studio when a drying shelf fell down and broke the balls on top of it. The critic further wrote, "The work illustrated a tense moment when something orderly has broken down, and we now have to reconstruct the pieces from memory." This was quoted from Pikiran Rakyat in 1978. Alia Swastika, a curator who wrote about this work in 2019, recounted the story of how Soemantri then deliberately dropped the balls on the floor before rearranged them along the rectangular shelves, which is the white objects here. Other critics then also praised Soemantri's efforts to reimagine ceramics and noted the conceptual direction of the medium in the exhibition. Now, in showcasing this new approach to ceramics, Soemantri also tapped into the spirit of the experimental period, which sought to include the everyday, such as the falling shelf incident, into the realm of visual art. The artworks in this exhibition also rejected the state's utilization of high tradition and its aesthetic hegemony by showing broken objects as well as objects in transformation. Untitled 4 highlighted the performative potential of the medium and her utilization of space around the objects that were in parallel with the experimental approach of the period. Scholars such as Sanento Yuliman, Sang Eugene, and Paul Ko in their works on Indonesian conceptualism argued that visual arts during the period utilized ready-made objects intended to directly communicate with the audience. The emphasis on materials such as rubber, wax, and plastics, which was not considered as art, was an aesthetic resistance brought by uneven processes of modernization in Indonesia in the 70s, and not from a deeply thought theorization of medium and artistic practice. Now, clay, however, appeared to be a different matter. Quite possibly, its strong roots in both low and high cultures, traditional and modern in Indonesia, makes its role as a medium for art to be also deeply ambivalent during this experimental period. As most of the ready-made objects utilized by the artists were objects that can be found in urban environment, I'm referring to the Gerakan Seni Rupa Baru artists, whether as waste or icons of consumption. Clay, however, as a material appeared to fall mostly outside this categorization and quite possibly showed the distinct limitations of the experimental period's discourse on the medium. Now, Hilda's experimental works largely received a positive reception during the period by both critics and also her younger peer because of a conceptual approach that placed objects and ideas above the accepted mainstream aesthetic. However, as I will discuss next, despite her strong contribution, she was largely ignored in the conversation about Indonesia's experimental period in the current discussion of the so-called origins of contemporaneity in Indonesian art. So we move on to the next second part of the presentation now. Now, in writing about gender and modernism in Indonesian art history, Yvonne Lowe noted that during the New Order regime, which was between 1966 to 1998, many Indonesian women artists focused their attention into becoming professionals instead of championing women's rights. Lowe stated that women artists, under the initiative of Nuansa Indonesia, which is a collective, if you like, of women painters established in 1984, supported many Indonesian women artists, which included Soemantri, who have participated in the exhibition. Sorry, Hilda. to exhibit their works publicly as a sign of their professional commitment to the arts. However, Nuansa Indonesia's exhibitions did not represent women's aesthetics or feminist art. Its aims echoed the government's view of peran ganda or dual role, that women could have the same rights, responsibilities, and opportunities with men, but yet this should not mitigate her role in fostering a happy family. It was within this environment of dual role, Hilda built her multiple roles as artist, academic, art historian, and later on curator. Hilda's perspective of the position of women in art was unambiguous. She stated, "Indonesia is a very accommodating society. Women have not been the underdogs, they have always been able to work. If a woman makes an issue of feminism, it is because she feels subservient to her husband. This is based more on personality than on culture." This was Hilda Soemantri's statement quoted in Asri Wright's book in 1994. So Asri Wright argued that Soemantri's statement should be read against her background as an upper middle class female artist who has traveled and trained outside Indonesia. Certainly, Soemantri's comment was not uncommon for the generation of women artists that built their career during the New Order regime, where women's destiny should take precedence over their commitment in the arts, as observed by Yvonne Lowe. There are also other factors that we could consider in explaining why her artworks and scholarships have not received further attention. Firstly, as an art historian, her focus on the pre-modern art, as you can see here, quite possibly perceived to fit more into the field of archaeology rather than art history. This is also a reflection of the historiography of modern art in Indonesia, where there is a heavy emphasis on painting, and until recently, the experimental scene on the 1970s that also largely ignored her solo exhibition in 1978. Secondly, when Soemantri arrived from her study in the US in 1977, she was already in her 30s and almost immediately got into work into establishing a new major in one of the Indonesia's was art school. FX Harsono, another Indonesian contemporary artist, one of the artists also in the New Art movement, recalled that while he attended the solo exhibition and admired her works, Hilda was relatively distant from the group's circle. She was not present during the public discussions or exhibitions the group. However, she was also not isolated from her peers. For example, Hilda eventually worked together with Jim Supangkat, if you recall, one of the artists included in the New Art movement in the 1990s in co-editing a book on Indonesian cultural heritage. This is the book here, Visual Art of Indonesia. And Supangkat also curated a show that included Soemantri in 1999. Therefore, it was possible that her age, background, and lack of engagement in politics during the 70s excluded her from the experimental period's polemical debate. At 32, she was considerably older than most of the artists involved in Black December Manifesto, New Art Movement, and PIPA Group. These are all the groups that came into prominence during the experimental period in the 70s. Hilda was also not an undergraduate student. In fact, she was already teaching at the Jakarta Art Institute and about to become a tenured faculty member or part of the establishment. In his recollection, Jim Supangkat referred to Soemantri as the Black Lady, and he wrote this in her obituary. Supangkat stated, menghadapi dominasi yang sudah sangat kusut itu, Hilda menjadi the Black Lady yang pemarah dan cenderung menyangkal semua persepsi yang mapan. Facing such complicated entanglements, Hilda became the Black Lady, who was quick to anger and tended to challenge every fixed perception. It is not entirely clear why Supangkat used the term, as there is no equivalent in Indonesian language for it. Yet the meaning was unambiguous. He used it to describe Soemantri's temperament, pemarah, quick to anger, and her refusal to accept the status quo as the driving force behind Soemantri's advocacy for ceramics and women artists. Soemantri indeed commented on the domestic demands on Indonesian women that slowed down the career of many artists, where she stated that in Indonesia, where there is a small number of female artists, most of them are painters, further emphasized the dominance of painting and male artists in the Indonesian art world. This was from 1996. From Supangkat's phrasing and also his description of Sumantri's works, it could well be that this perception of angry women also contributed to the lack of discussion of Sumantri's legacy on modern art history in Indonesia. Moreover, despite Sumantri's attempt, or Hilda's attempt to compartmentalize her scholarship with her artworks, her curatorial projects and writings of women artists merge her practice as both an artist and as an intellectual. In contrast to the earlier statement quoted in Wright's book, the 1994 one, Supangkat's statement, in fact, confirms Soemantri, Hilda, as someone who fought for equality for women artists in Indonesia. And lastly, despite Soemantri's attempt to Suemantri's strong advocacy of ceramics as an expression of modern art in Indonesia possibly put her odds with the shift in writings about modern and contemporary art in Indonesia. While Soemantri fought for the inclusion of ceramics as a legitimate medium in Indonesian visual arts, the latter became increasingly geared towards the concept of modernism, where terms such as beauty, aesthetic experience were replaced by anything goes and activist-inspired art practices. Hilda kept a clear separation between her artistic work and her scholarship. Her artwork in the 1990s, as you can see here, showed the strong influence of the formalist style from her training in the Bandung Art School, despite her earlier foray into experimental works. She stated, in contrast to some artists who delight in seeking inspiration from the past, I always kept the old and the new apart. She explained that she drew her inspiration for her artworks not from her study of the pre-modern world, but from the emotional and spiritual inner worlds. She attributed this attitude to a reverence towards what she would consider as the cultural and spiritual values from the objects that she studied. Yet ironically, the terracotta figurines that became her area of expertise had its origins in the quotidian and the vernacular. Yet perhaps it was precisely because of her intimate knowledge of the material and technique as a writer, she was unable to push Indonesian ceramics outside its close discourse. While writers such as Supangkat, Irianto, and Ihsan have pointed out the challenges of positioning ceramics within Indonesian modern art discourse, Sumantri's own writings rarely engage with artists such as Dadang Kristanto or F.X. Harsono, who have utilized clay as a conceptual medium. With the exception of a short piece that Hilda wrote in 2000 about the work of Asmujo Irianto, Hilda's writings reflected her compartmentalization of the superficially disparate fields. It is notable that she stated that the separation between art and craft was irrelevant. Her thoughts on this matter is worth quoting at length. In a recent encounter with the Old Javanese dictionary, the author was struck by the word beauty in Old Javanese, lango, meaning aesthetic experience, romantic feelings, raptures of love. Beauty for the Javanese is the blending of feeling and form, the recognition of a common element in the viewer as well as in the viewed, which brings about a feeling of rapture. It would seem that the attainment of beauty is to create something that brings about this sensation. Now, Sumantri's discussion of the word lango suggested a preoccupation with sensation and contemplation, less with warmer qualities, as long as the object is capable of stimulating these feelings. This observation that came from a study of pre-modern art echoed with the practices of many contemporary artists in Indonesia today. Some Indonesian women artists such as Caroline Winata, Tika Winata, and Tisa Granisia are working with with skill-based medium that would be classified as craft while still retaining their conceptual framing. Now, moreover, Hilda's reading of a mutual recognition of commonality between the viewer and the view suggested that she was also attuned to the effective exchange between the object and the viewer. This was exemplified in her statement in a curatorial essay for another artist, Iriantin Karnaya, in 1996. The artist studied her material as it is, without associating it with any ideas. She let her material speak for itself and find its own form. So Hilda's understanding of the material's own life as a potential for aesthetic possibilities stemmed not only from her formalist training, but also from her knowledge of material culture from the pre-modern past. In hindsight, her perceptive reading of the small tradition, or the low tradition as compared to the high tradition, could pave the way into thinking not only the politics of the medium, but also about the agency of objects through a network of affect. For example, this image here that I included by XX Lab, which is an all-female art collective based in Jogja, could be framed through this understanding of the medium. The collective's works presented a different understanding of materiality that combines citizen activism, science, and feminism beyond white gallery walls. The work echoed Hilda's statement as the material that speaks of its own. The collective's use of material does not disappear into artistic transformation or into material structural law. It remains present as a kind of artistic intervention. So to conclude, as a researcher myself who seeks the trace of female-centered art history in Indonesia, the contradictory elements of Sumantri's narrative is another reminder about the multifaceted aspects of gender and the writing of art history in Indonesia. Sumantri's earlier view on gender and women artists must be understood against her own middle-class background and the socio-cultural background of New Order Indonesia at the time. But it was also clear that there has been significant challenges to reposition two aspects marginalized in Indonesian art discourse, namely women and the ceramics as medium. I shall leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wulan. That is a very, very interesting paper.
I will stop sharing now.
Okay.
Okay.
Will,
Yes,
no,
that
we'll
works.
probably, look it up later if there are any questions in regards to the PowerPoints just now. Okay,
Okay.
I would like to invite anybody who have any questions. Either you can write in the chat box in WebEx, or if you're watching us live from Arts USMFB, you can have you can type in your questions below the live stream. Then we will bring up the questions to Dr. Wulan. Okay, I just have a question just to start off our discussion or conversation this morning. Wulan is I forgot to which is normal of me to mention that actually Dr. Wulan is the author of Feminisms and Contemporary Arts in Indonesia, and she has many years worked within the issues of gender in Indonesia as well, especially in terms of the arts. I was just wondering, besides Hilda Soemantri, were there any other pertinent female artists who are sort of like linked to the Gerakan Seni Rupa Baru in Indonesia at that time? Yeah, because I'm not really familiar about that.
Yeah. You mean women artists or?
Yes.
Okay. There were a number of women participated or part of the Seni Rupa Baru movement. I think there were 3 of them. And so between 75 and 79, there were a small number of artists, but then when the group sort of get together again in 87, there were more women artists joining the second the 87 exhibition, simply because that exhibition Pasaraya Dunia Fantasi, there was a much bigger undertaking, but also more interdisciplinary. So they have designers, you know, so coming from all sorts of training background, but not in the first 3 exhibitions of the Seni Rupa Baru.
So, what, I was just thinking along research as a whole, what makes you pick Hilda, right? Because you mentioned that there were like a few, 2 or 3 other artists at the time as well. So,
Yeah.
what is within Hilda's work that's like so stand out that you feel that you need to sort of like bring her into the highlight of your own research, right? Thinking that you had a book before, then what makes her special for your own research, current research project right now?
I'm currently working on a slightly different research project. You know this, but at the same time, I'm also still committed, if you like, to thinking, writing, and researching about, you know, kind of thinking about different ways of writing art history, if you like, in Indonesia. Looking and writing at art history differently, if you like. So I guess that's the main concern of my work. So I started with kind of gender critique, framing Indonesian art history through feminist lens, if you like, and now through, you know, kind of investigation into the social political content of the work. But what really made me go back to Hilda is precisely because of that missed encounter. Right, in 97 or 98, that was the time, or maybe after, when a group of us wanted to meet with Hilda. And then, so that stayed on my mind. And then I began to kind of go back to, you know, an earlier project and thinking about the contribution of women in Indonesian art history. And then that brought me closer to Hilda again. I mentioned that Hilda, in the my initial interest was really as a practitioner, but now also as an art historian.
So, you know, like in the context of Malaysia and also Indonesia, you know, this is like a lifelong issue. I don't know, I mean, how far it is with Indonesia, but like the fact that there is no art history department in Malaysia, you know, the art history has to feel as a, you know, less developed area of research. I was just thinking along when you use or when you mentioned like different ways of writing art history, because we have a lot of people doing sort of like quote unquote art history research, okay? But you know, maybe in a kind of like post-gradish kind of like perspective that um, what is the sort of like established art history writing in Indonesia, like or in general, so that sometimes I have this you know, because sometimes I felt that we do not ask enough questions, you know, then what is already out there, so we do not, you know, find solutions or thinking differently that so that we can read these artworks within a different perspective or notion, right? So maybe you can elaborate more on that, on like different ways of writing art history. Not only in Indonesian context, but maybe like in general,
Right.
because you're also working in Australia right now.
Well, yes, I am. Yeah, so I guess it's always it's always worth considering when we're talking about Indonesian art history. It's very much an art history that is centered on one or two particular areas. So it doesn't, when we think of Indonesian art history, and if we refer to the texts that are commonly published, whether in Indonesia or the English-speaking world, it's always about experiences and writings about artists from Java or Bali or Sumatra by the most. And so it's worth thinking more critically about that. Right, but at the same time, it's also an art history that is still, if you like, a work in progress. So more and more scholars now are discovering, archival sources and so on. So there's more awareness of that by the current generation of scholars to think about Indonesian art history differently, because the text by Claire Holt, for example, that's often quoted as the founding text, one of the founding texts of Indonesian art history. Similarly, with Sujoyono's writings, Sujoyono, who's also an Indonesian painter, but also a writer. So I think what a lot of art historians are doing now, Indonesian art historians, are looking at a reappraisal of that works, of those foundational works, if you like, because again, throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, that's pretty much the understanding of Indonesian art history as we know. I'm interested in this kind of this division, if you like, of disciplinary boundaries of archaeology and art history, for example. I'm interested in that, and I don't think that has been unpacked again. It's also probably thinking about, the impact of colonization in establishing those disciplines, and then it, kind of trickle down to how we think of art history these days. And so, and of course, the gendered dimension of art history, writing of art history as well. I think that's important to consider.
In terms of methodology, I mean, as fundamental as the method, right? I mean, you mentioned like archival research just now, but how do you approach your research? In this particular research, in terms of your methodology.
Yeah, with Hilda, it's primarily archival, but I've also managed to track people who used to work with her, because initially this project was also about her role as an educator in Jakarta Art Institute. So discussion with her, interviewing her colleagues, her former students. I think that's part of it, because this wasn't a very long time ago when she was teaching and she was learning. So there's a lot more access, if you like, to her works. And the next stage would be to get in touch with her family as well. And interestingly, there's also been a reappraisal of her work, because her work has been included in the last Jogja Biennial in 2019. And so that there seems to be a drive towards including kind of discussion on the inclusion or the exclusion of gender within Indonesia itself. I find that really important to continue. But I've been mostly working with contemporary art, if you like, art from the 1990s until today. So speaking with the artist is incredibly important, because you know, that's when you know, the understanding of the work really, or the work itself came to life really from that discussion. Mm.
I would like to ask the audience if do you have any questions? You can unmute yourself and ask Dr. Wulan here. It's not you know, a daily occasion to have Dr. Wulan here with us today. Oh, we have okay, we have a question from Amy. She asked
Amy.
Amy on the she sent it privately though. But do you think there are any limitations in studying female artists as female researchers? Yeah. Are there any limitations in studying female artists as female researcher? If there are any limitations, what are they? Oh, yeah, maybe, yeah.
Thank you for the question, but I was wondering, what made you ask the question?
Oh, I don't know, Amy?
If Amy would like to, Amy would like
Amy,
to
unmute
share.
yourself.
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, yeah.
As
Ask
a
me.
female researcher, when we research about the female artists, maybe we can't think about how the other human, like how the other male researcher to think about this. So I just wonder if as a female researchers, if have any limitation in studying the female artists. Just if have the limitations, what are they?
Yeah. Okay. This is an interesting question, but also I don't want to speak for other female researchers, if you like. I can only share my own experience of
Yes.
working in the field, because you know, as much as there are similarities, if you like, or commonalities, female researchers, there are differences in this regard. And so it really depends on how you approach your subject matter, if you like. Because what I found, the limitations are often, it's often practical matters, right? But it is limitations. For example, you know, anecdotally, there's always been the challenges of doing a research or field work on the area where it's not particularly safe for women to conduct an interview at night, for example, because you don't, you know, feel safe. You feel less safe than a male researcher walking in a particular area at night in a particular place. I think those concerns are real. Right? So there are no. So another challenges would be, you know, which is probably not so limited to, or perhaps not limited to, but as a parent, for example, right? How do you then bring your family or child on a field work, on an interview? Those are not limitations as well as such, but those are certainly the kind of practical challenges that researchers have to negotiate in the field. Hopefully this is not only female researchers, but also male researchers who's taking on, you know, their family to field work and so on. These are the practical aspects that one needs to consider. But also it depends on whether you are researching as part of that community. For example, I'm Indonesian, but I've lived abroad for so long that yet people, when I interviewed women artists in Indonesia, they still consider me as part of part of the Indonesian community, if you like. But at the same time, it's also always worth checking your privileges, if you like, where you're from, what your knowledge and how you approach the subject matter. That's clearly more important. I guess it's not just limited to women, but also to men. Also considering about, I think building rapport is very important, and there are certain advantages, I think, by being a woman when to do this, how it would work. For example, I was pregnant when I was conducting my field work. It was so interesting that the differences that I experienced before I was pregnant and when I was pregnant conducting my field work. People are more open, they're more welcoming. They did not see me as a threat, coming in and asking all the hard questions about gender and feminism. So I was fussed around constantly, and that was a really interesting shift, I thought.
I think that's a very that is a very pertinent. I mean, it is not as women as a subject matter, but if you turn the other side of the coin is that the kind of challenges that a female researcher has to negotiate, right? Because both of us have families, and if at a postgraduate level, most of the candidates are or do have family, and they have to negotiate all of this. Now, of course, it is not only like female-centric issues, but also male researchers do face those problems as well. But in a way, it is as women carries more of the the burden of caring and nurturing the family, then we have to sort of like negotiate that aspect more than the husband or the father. So I think like it's a very interesting and very pertinent question, not only to ask the artists, but it's also as a researcher our experience as well. Okay. Do you have any other questions?
Yeah, morning, Dr. Sarena.
Oh yes, Chui, yeah.
This is Chui Yi, and thank you so much for sharing your plan. I'm quite enjoying about your researches, and as in the conclusion section, you have mentioned about the women artists and their gender problem. You mentioned about when they are doing the research, we have mentioned about the gender. We have to be associated with social and cultural background. This is also the problem which I doing my research. I'm facing about how do you connect those social and cultural background to the gender and the women artists?
Sorry, I'm writing your question down here. Okay. I think it's part of what shaped their practice, right? The kind of social, cultural, economic class, if you like, race. That's what's really important, and that's what shaped their practice, and also how their practice emerged from that kind of the particular specific female subjectivity. So it's important to put that in perspective in their practice as an artist who create works or produce works, and also balance that with their background, because they a woman artists, they often, or artists, they feel they wear multiple hats, and oftentimes the problem with writing about women artists is a heavy focus on their biography, right? And connecting their biography, their life experiences with their practice. And so, so this is where that suggestion of the issue of balance come out, because then you need to consider the hard labor that they put in, the creative aspect of processes that they're making, also equally important as their who they are as an artist. But at the same time, it also shape their perception, their worldview, and their art making, their social cultural background as women, if you like. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's a very nice answer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chuyi, for the question. Is there anybody else?
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
I have a question for Sarena, actually. Well, I'm also equally interested in the if you like, the writing of art history in Malaysia. So if you can share a little bit of that as well. You kind of asked me in the beginning about how do we, or in my own work, how what kind of art history that I'm writing, if you like. And what about you? What about the field in Malaysia?
I think in a way, these circumstances, because you quoted Yvonne Lau's work. Of course, we all know Yvonne, and I've also referred to her work substantially. The perception is that it's almost a similar issue as in those. There are artists, mostly male artists. There are a few female artists as well, and I don't know. Is there a complaint about not being visible? I don't know, because I haven't investigated within the gender lens, in terms of that kind of perspective. So, but it comes with a sense of privilege, because they either had attained a scholarship to go abroad, and then they came back and all that. And of course, this kind of research doesn't fall off more of the the feminist kind of like a trajectory, but more in a way that the kind of like female or women artist research that I've read would sort of like pose it or discuss this within the female experience rather than kind of like feminist kind of experience. Okay, so the kind of art history, I don't know. I mean, I've never like interested with gender issues actually. Wulan, it's not because like I just felt that as a researcher, I don't know. I mean, I felt that I should as a researcher I should be do not see myself as female or male. I mean, I probably need to quote somebody on this, but I sort of see myself as not having a gender, either male or female. So I'll just do it as a teacher. But of course, personally, like we face those kind of experience, and for day-to-day living as well, we juggle, we negotiate the kind of household responsibilities and all that. But as in terms of my own commitment to art history, for example, I do not position myself from a male or female perspective. I don't know. I mean, I don't see it as problematic, but of course we need more people looking at gender issues in Malaysia in terms of the arts. Actually, one of my students did a her master's on female artists 2000 onwards. So I mean, there should be more research on it, I think. Yeah.
But I also feel that at the same time, it's also shaped, the way we select our projects, no?
Yeah.
In terms of that, I mean, thinking about what you said about balancing and juggling, right? Yeah. Mm.
Yeah.
I mean, my question was really more broadly, but you know, you kind of specifically looking at gender issues. I mean, I mean, I gather from your discussion that introduction in the beginning that the students are mostly from practicing background, um, and so yeah, so I just want to open up this discussion whether there's any sense of comparison between Indonesia and Malaysia that you know, you spot or their spot in this regard. But if you narrow it down to that kind of gender lens, then yep. Mm.
Okay, any other questions from the floor online? Oh, okay.
Okay.
All right, we have one here. In our thesis, how do we use field or survey data, such as face-to-face interviews of artists? Should we use what they say directly or reorganize their text?
Let me just check.
Yeah.
Okay. What do you mean by reorganize the text?
Okay. I know. Amy, you want to unmute yourself? Rewrite the text.
Oh, do you mean direct quotation or
rewrite the, rewrite the. How would you?
How would I? Depends. I think sometimes it's important to directly quote the artist. So because it's important to have the artist's voice for when we writing about their work, like, you know, the process of interpretation, right? But it's important to have their voice in the text. But at the same time, I think that's what I tend to do, because you know, I have a list of questions, and then I can see whether the artist kind of answered that directly or indirectly. For example, I guess we also have to be alert of the things that they're not saying as much as what they're saying, because that contributes to kind of the you know, the richness, if you like, of their work, and our own reading of their work. Yeah.
Okay.
Is that how would you advise your students, Sarena?
I know. I mean, the question was from Amy.
Yeah. Yeah. No. I mean, is that how would you would advise your students?
Yeah, I guess in a way, like yeah, I do agree with you that certain things directly, if it creates an impact, you know, you should quote it directly. If there are, of course, you cannot be an entire quotation, right? Like chapters full with quotation, so you need to sort of reword and put it into a more critical perspective in terms of writing.
Yeah, that's very important to kind of contextualize their works and put your critical understanding of their works, because I think as much as their voice is important, they also can occasionally self-mythologize.
So following up to that, when you mention that things that are not being said, how do you sort of like infer from make a point from things that are not being said?
Well, I think it's connected to my current research project, which is currently I'm working on a project on investigating historical violence and contemporary art in Indonesia. So historical violence that I discuss is the anti-communist killings in 1965 and 66. So this was a very a turning point, if you like, in Indonesian history. And so the artists that I interviewed, they're second and third generation artists, and occasionally, or not occasionally, but I also interviewed survivors during the time, so former political prisoners. And they have, particularly the second and and the survivors, they've experienced some really horrific account, right, or witness or experience that, and oftentimes they have told this story in other places, or their testimonies have been recorded. So when we ask the questions, when we ask difficult questions, we also must be sensitive to this, right? And so I listen to the tones, I listen to the allusions, and so I get that sense, that what they want to communicate through the answers, rather than literally the answers that they give me. In doing so, I also cross-reference with other documents, other forms of testimonies, so I can build a full picture, if you like. But oftentimes, this full picture is also not enough to convey the this difficult experience that they had, right? So again, that leaves a big room, a gap, if you like, that has to be acknowledged, that is a gap, and why that gap is there in their story.
Okay, thank you. That's very important. I think this is very fundamental as our candidates are taking up field research, doing interview and all that. They need to learn to sort of like decipher the the interview transcription and things like that, and also be very sensitive to what or how does the artist or the interviewees responded to your questions.
But
Okay.
also always ask for their consent, right
Yeah,
in the beginning.
Yeah.
Before you start with anything else, consent is important.
So the ethical form is very important to all of SOTA School of the Arts students. I know it is high time for University of Science Malaysia as well and School of the Arts to take up our candidates to take up the ethical human ethics consent. So it starting from this year, it is compulsory for our SOTA postgraduate students to actually ask for those for those official permissions from the university.
But I guess I also want to alert that in my own work, sometimes a written consent, a formal document, can be very difficult to obtain, because many, particularly the second generation artists, they have experienced censorship and political discrimination from the state, right? So for them, a written piece of paper that they need to sign is another, can be evocative of that
So how do you negotiate that? I was just wondering, how do you, because you do a lot of interviews during your own PhD works as well. So how do you negotiate that if, of course, we have the consent in terms of doing the interviews from the university, but then when we interview the artists, for example, like some of them might, will agree to it, will self-censor, for example, in terms of answers, and be careful with what you answer. How do you know, like, is this something that is actually true that you can use in your research, or you can quote on it to justify your own argument? Like, how do you make that kind of selections? Or because we also do not want to like communicate wrongly of what they answer, or
Yeah,
that kind of
yeah,
thing? Yeah. How do you sort of like
yeah,
negotiate that, filter out
Yeah.
that is the answers that is
yeah.
actually not true or not actually genuine?
Mm. Well, building trust is important. I think, before consent, you build your trust with them. And this is, oftentimes where, for me at least, field work takes the longest. Building initial connection, building the trust, but and also, as I mentioned before, cross-reference, cross-check. But most of the time, the artists that I talk to, they're really quite happy to explain, to discuss their works, because this is who they are. This is what they do, right? So when they, so you can, and of course, you always need to go back to them and check again. Are you happy with the way that you represented, not represented, but are you okay with this quote from our last interview? This is how you quoted in my text. You need to check with them as well.
All right, so thank you very much. I do not see any more questions in the chat, or if there anybody else who wants to ask any questions, last chance. Okay, all right, thank you. Okay, thank you so much everybody for being here. Okay, there is a link in the chat box, so you can register in the through the link. Okay, thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Dr. Wulan Dirgantoro from University of Melbourne, for being here and sharing your research experience, your work on Hilda Soemantri, your research experience, your method in your art history. And of course, thank you for spending 1 hour and 15 minutes with all of us here.
Thank you, Sarena, for the
Okay.
invitation. And hey, we can fill up the hour.
Okay, thank you everybody. See you in our next research in section next month, or if not next month, maybe in most likely going to be June. Okay, thank you so much. Bye bye. Take care.